Welcome everybody, and thank you so much for joining us on for this webinar on developing leadership agility and how we did this at Merck. Teresa and I are delighted to share with you what we've learned along our journey on a topic that we're so passionate about. Before we get into it, a couple of technical issues I want to get us out of the way. One, if you are having a technical issue, please message via the Q&A box and we'll help you out. Two, we've muted everybody, so no matter how loud you scream, we will not hear you. But we do want to hear from you, so please send questions during the presentation and we will select those that we can to address at the end of the webcast. And as you'll see, there's a resource library of some materials and things that we at Heidrick have produced that you might find interesting and related to this topic. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Teresa, who I'll just mention is one of the more innovative learning leaders that I've known in my career, and she's also done an extraordinary job at connecting with the business issues at Merck.
Thanks, Steve. I'm delighted to be here today. Thanks for the invitation. I've had the opportunity to be in the learning and development business for about 30 years now, and this is one of the more exciting programs that I've had the opportunity to be part of, so I'm really excited to share it with you all today. You, Steve. Thanks.
And I'm Steve Krupp. I'm a partner at Heidrick. A little over 2 years ago, a firm that I was leading was acquired by Heidrick & Struggles as part of our strategy to build world-class consulting. And at Heidrick Consulting, I'm one of the thought leaders in our leadership development service line or center of excellence. So we're going to cover 3 areas today. We're going to share a bit about our research and what we've learned about leadership agility. Specifically, we're going to bring to life what are some of those behaviors. People talk about we hear this over and again, how do we become more agile? We're going to define that for you, and most importantly, share how this was embedded deeply in a succession acceleration program over a couple of years within Merck's manufacturing division. So we're going to start by getting you engaged and asking you to think about a question. What do these organizations that you're looking at have in common? These are names that you all know. And typically when we ask this question, I'm going to answer this one for you, and the next one you'll do a poll. But what we hear is, these companies aren't around anymore. They're basically all gone or just hanging on by a thread. Two, the other thing that's interesting about these organizations is that at a time, they were the best in their space. They were dominant in their industry. Kodak, at one time, had 90% of the market share of cameras in the U.S. BlackBerry, if you just go back 5, 6 years, every one of you probably had a BlackBerry, or most of you had a BlackBerry. And you can remember when Blockbuster came on the scene and became a powerhouse in the world of video. But they're all gone. And then the third thing, perhaps, that they have in common is they didn't adapt. They were not able to adapt to the changing environment that we're all living in. So we want to ask you a question, and there's a poll that we're going to ask you to respond to. Which of these reasons do you think were the biggest factors in why these companies haven't been able to make it and survive in this kind of new world? Just give you a few seconds to make your choice. Okay, let's see what the perspectives are out there. All right, so not anticipating or pivoting with market changes is by far the largest, 46%. Not testing assumptions is next at 30. Not shifting priorities quickly at 19, and not bouncing back under 5. So interesting. So and again, our point of view is these are all actually critical. But if I had to pick the 2, I think I would agree with the group that not anticipating or being able to adapt to market changes, actually like Kodak invented the first digital camera, but they weren't able to pivot. Not testing assumptions or old ways of thinking, is a really, really dangerous one. And if you take BlackBerry or Nokia, when the iPhone came out, they said, well, that's not a very good iPhone. It's not a very good phone. It doesn't have all the features. It doesn't have a keyboard. And they couldn't break out of their old model of what had become the status, and they couldn't quite recognize that this was something new and different and that they needed to challenge some of those assumptions. But if you look at all of these together, in our way of thinking about it, they actually, let me go see if I can go back one. They actually can't. They add up to agility, and we'll talk about that more as we go forward. So I think you all know this, so we'll just kind of quickly go through it. But the world around us is changing faster than we can keep up with. If you go to 85% of jobs, in 2030, right, have not even been invented yet. 30 billion connected devices. It's an amazing amount of people who are actually, using technology in different ways. 4 devices for every person in the future. The gig economy is here to stay and forever, and we spend about $1 trillion on the cybersecurity. So radical changes. But more important to all of us, 26% of companies are falling off the Fortune 500 every year. So those who have been powerful in the past, as you saw from the first slide, are increasingly challenged to stay nimble, to stay agile. And so let's talk about the agility imperative. As we go from organization to organization, and this is what Teresa told us when we started working on succession acceleration, is that we need leaders who are more agile, more strategic, more transformative. Without that, we're going to lose our advantage. We're going to miss opportunities. We're going to become one of those, dinosaurs that didn't make it, like the list that we saw on the first slide. So powerful, critical capability. But the question is, what does that mean? How do you become more agile? So we did some research, and again, I think there's some of the library resources if you want to learn more about this, because I'm going to give you a very quick thumbnail sketch of the research that we've done. But we looked at which companies are outperforming their industry. And in fact, we looked at the companies that were at the top 20% of revenue growth in their industry over 3 years and 7 years. So they had to be at the top for the medium, short term, 3 years, and long term. They had to do this without relying on acquisitions, and they basically had to do it without dropping their margin. So they had to grow in a very consistent, sustained way in this world. This research was done, it's finished up just 2 years ago, so it's really focused on organizations doing this now. And we identified really only 25 super accelerators who were able to achieve that high level of being in the top over that period of time. Some of the organizations were like Apple and Google, not surprisingly, or Starbucks or Comcast, a local one for us in Philly. But we then said, well, what are they doing differently? And that's really what's important. We then did qualitative research. We actually interviewed CEOs, heads of HR from all of those accelerators, and we did survey research with about half of the 500 largest companies in the world to get underneath what are the ones who are performing better doing differently. And we came out of that with a fairly clear set of capabilities that these organizations and leaders were either doing differently or doing better. And I'm just going to give you at the highest level overview. So they were mobilizing their organization better, which means they were paying attention to the customer and setting priorities that inspire the organization to be the best in their space. So they really motivated the organization. We want to be at the top of our industry by staying close and putting the customer first. Interestingly, we talk a lot about transformation and agility, but these organizations were great at execution. They were great at preserving the core and managing the core and harnessing it by making sure they were optimizing resources, putting them where they were needed, and really being excellent at operational excellence. At the same time, and this is the challenge, the paradox of leading today, you've got to preserve the core while you reinvent yourself. And think of a big organization like IBM. IBM has reinvented itself 3 or 4 times, in our recent history. They were a technology company, an equipment company, then they became a services company and an IT consulting company. Now they're a digital company. And if IBM, in fact, is able to survive, it'll be because of Watson, because they have become an AI, basically an AI artificial intelligence company and a data analytics company. That would be the key. On the other hand, Netflix has reinvented itself 3 times. Still does the core business of making videos available to all of us, or making movies available to all of us, but they've done it in a very different way, and now they've transformed to a content business. So the ability to execute and transform at the same time is really what these companies distinguish themselves by. But most important, and the research said that the one thing that that was sort of the multiplier effect, those companies who demonstrated agility, actually the ability to pivot faster and adapt quicker, had the greatest competitive advantage. Interestingly, for all of those on the phone or on the webinar who were interested in developing leaders, what we learned when we looked closely at leaders, and we've done now over the past couple of years, we've researched this with thousands and thousands of leaders, we've looked at the correlation between agility and growth potential. And in fact, we started saying that high agility is actually potential. What's that magic, the magic bullet that we're all looking for is how do we assess potential and how do we develop potential? Our conclusion was it's about agility. And what we found is that leaders who scored higher on agility actually were more likely than those who were lower on agility to be able to take on bigger roles and to take on more expanded opportunities in their organizations. So again, we concluded that if you had to pick one thing to be great at, it would be agility. So what is agility? So let's break it down. And you may remember these words because they were what we asked you to rate before in terms of the most critical dimensions, but now we're labeling them the way we do when we define agility. And first of all, it's foresight. And if you think about how we assess potential, it's always been about smarts, but today it's not about having high IQ. It's about being able to see what's coming faster. And again, this is what you said was the biggest critical failure that you saw in those organizations. So foresight is the ability to anticipate and then be prepared to adjust faster. So that's foresight. Then adapting is, okay, it's one thing to see what's coming. Kodak saw what was coming, but they couldn't shift priorities. They couldn't get the organization moving and behaving differently, and that's about adaptability. And of course, as you do this, you're going to try things, and therefore you need, and again, Teresa will talk about this, you need a learning culture, the ability to try things, test things, as we all now talk about, fail fast, continually iterate, not be afraid of trying and failing, but in fact, in today's world, in a volatile, uncertain world, in fact, learning fast may be the single most important thing in addition to foresight. And lastly, because you are going to try things and fail, and you're going to have ups and downs, resilience, which you felt was the least important. And I think that's because most of us have learned to be resilient, and so we almost take it for granted. But bouncing back, persevering, getting back on that horse is the fourth dimension. So when we assess, evaluate, measure agility, these are the 4 things that we assess through our leadership acceleration questionnaire. And when we try to develop agility, as we did with Merck and in partnership with Teresa and her whole team, these are the things that the capabilities that we're really trying to build and trying to hone. just to bring it to life a little bit, I mentioned Netflix earlier. My guess is a lot of you on this webinar are Netflix users. And Netflix, as you'll see in a minute, has been one of the most successful companies probably in the world over the last 10 years and right up till the moment. But let's look at Reed Hastings and bring it to life a little bit. So what is, when we say foresight, so Netflix actually anticipated the future of streaming well before they were doing it. In fact, they approached Blockbuster and said, hey, Blockbuster, the future is going to be not DVDs and not CVR. It's going to be it's not videos, but it's going to be streaming. And they said, we'll be your streaming partner. And Blockbuster said, that'll never happen. People are going to want to have that disc and to hold on to it. So they anticipated where the market was going, and even at the beginning, when you were still renting, they were sending those discs to your house, they were Netflix. But then they got ahead of themselves. You may again remember, if you were a Netflix user, that they said, we're going to make our content available to you in two ways. They actually formed a group that was the streaming business, and they formed a group that was the disc business. And they thought customers would want one or the other, and each would be cheaper. But if you were a customer that wanted both, if you were a family and the parents still wanted to get their DVD, and the kids were into streaming, it would actually cost you more. And they lost about 80,000. They missed it. They lost about 80,000 customers overnight or within weeks, and their stock price catered. And what did Hastings do? The CEO, he said, we blew it. He apologized, quickly reversed the decision, went back to a model that you could afford both and not have to pay more, and moved on. And that gave them permission to go on from there, to not only keep growing both domestically and now globally. It gave them such loyalty with customers that they were able to then transition into a new model of developing content. And as you know, because you probably watch some of their shows, Netflix is now really surging as one of the best content producers in the business. And they are continually running experiments. They're continually learning from what consumers and what all of us are doing and how we're using their solutions and how we're using their products and what we're responding to as they just continue to grow dramatically. So Hastings, and as a leader and as a CEO, and Netflix as a company, has really been a prototype illustration of how to be agile, including bouncing back. And check it out, it's paid off. They have grown dramatically. I think, they've grown their revenue, I think, by fourfold in the last years. And you can see the stock price in 2013, was sort of hovering below 50 and is now pushing above 400. It's a pretty impressive performance. So again, the point we've been trying to make, what we started with our research was, we looked at what great companies do in terms of performance, and then we looked at the behaviors that they demonstrate so that we could be confident that we were focusing on things that really move the needle. So we're going to do one more kind of poll to challenge you with. We want you to rank the level of agility that you see in the leaders in your organization or the leaders that you're working with, and just fill in. Is it a 1 to 5 scale? And we'll just give you a moment to say where are the leaders that you're seeing in terms of their agility. I'm going to give you 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Let's see what you said. So, interestingly, we have sort of a bell curve, a little bit weighted lower, but the majority of you felt you were kind of middling. I think about, 19% were 4, and so, a bunch of you feel you're in a good place, but a larger bunch feel like you don't have the agility that you're probably going to need to take this forward. So that was the dilemma that Teresa was facing, and I'm going to turn this to her, and she's going to take it from here.
Thanks, Steve. You're right. As we looked at preparing our leaders for the future, one of the things that we began to assess was the agility of our leadership. And we did find that this was an area that we could definitely develop. Before I talk any further about the Merck case, I just wanted to remind all of you and invite you, Steve, thanks for sharing so much tremendous research, but any of you online that have questions, don't hesitate to chat them into us, because we'll certainly look to address those as we go to the question and answer portion of our webinar. So as we said earlier, I have had the pleasure of being part of Global Learning and Development's leadership team, and I head up learning for Merck's global manufacturing business, and we have over 50 sites around the globe. And as we really looked at leadership and where we were continuing to transform and drive the business, we noticed that the strength of our overall leadership pipeline wasn't exactly where we needed it to be in terms of our the roles that directly reported into our manufacturing leadership team. And so when we looked further into it, agility did come up, as we said, as one of the key elements that we felt we needed to continue to grow. We focused on critical roles. We identified capabilities, both functional capabilities, technical capabilities, and certainly leadership capabilities like agility, to say what did we need to develop to become truly competitive and stay ahead in this VUCA world. And so we decided to approach this a bit differently. And as Steve said, we decided that we were going to experiment a little bit. And we wanted to ensure that not only were we developing our leaders, but we wanted to move them from a place in succession planning where they were 2 to 5 years out from a leadership role to under 2 years. And so we really wanted to get tremendous lift. So we decided that we couldn't do that by conventional means. And we wanted to really think about very individually the individuals in the cohort and also look at the cohort as a whole. Our goal was to decrease the time to readiness to be a leader. So we were focused on experience that would not just develop them, but accelerate these cohort members, that would provide a different view, that would provide them with experiences to really develop their capabilities. We had deeply engaged sponsorship. So we actually began or had the program committed to under one divisional president who kicked off the program for us, and literally the day of the kickoff, our current divisional president stepped into role. And what I will tell you is that it has been a true game-changing platform for both presidents, who believed very deeply that the success of the organization really rested with these future leaders. And so they were extremely engaged, and we'll talk a little bit about how tremendously engaged they were. We also worked with our HR business partners who partnered with us through the selection process, how we developed the program, coaching leaders and engaging throughout the program. And our full senior leader team was extremely present throughout all portions of this program, particularly our residentials. But interestingly, they all also took on roles as what we called diagonal coaches. And in many cases, they coached more than one program participant. We really leaned out of our comfort zone because we didn't predetermine the curriculum, and this is where it got very interesting for us in a number of places, because we really wanted to build a custom program based on where they were, the cohorts as individuals and as a cohort in terms of their capabilities against the roles that they were going to be targeted to take. And so that meant that we needed to be extremely agile. We needed to be extremely ready to go in any direction. And so not only did this program develop the agility of our cohort, it developed mine and my team's agility as well. And lastly, we do use and leverage our enterprise leadership programs, our talent programs, which we found was fantastic because a number of folks in our cohort also had participated in those, and our goal was really to have a complementary program that built on these capabilities. So without further ado, let me share with you the acceleration program. So we called it Succession Acceleration, not terribly inventive. We were trying to, in fact, accelerate their succession in the organization. At the center, you see that we felt that in addition to the the ownership of the participant in the cohort, we also felt like the manager was critical in guiding the work, because we were really going to expect these folks to stretch into different kinds of assignments and truly take on different roles, and so their managers need to be able to support them in that. And then diagonal coaches, I mentioned a bit earlier, were critical, and these were leaders at least 1 to 2 levels above the folks in the cohort or their participant, and typically not in their chain of hierarchy, but at least probably more towards the area that they were trying to develop towards. And so we began with working with our HR partners and the senior leaders to select candidates based on our talent and succession planning process. Once we had the cohort established, there were 2 assessments that they took, a competency assessment based on the role that they were aspiring to move towards. And so this was also an experiment for us. We had never been that transparent as to say to someone, we think you can get to this role and that's where we're targeting you. And we obviously checked to make sure they were as excited about that role as we were excited about them taking that role. And then that was truly the basis of the assessment. What was it going to take to get them from here to there? And of course, we did the leadership agility work as well to see what kind of leadership capability we needed to develop. Then we planned. And we brought them together for the kickoff. We did a leadership piece, a seminar, a workshop on geometry of a career development, where we worked with them to get a lot more aggressive in the way that they were career planning. We wanted them to take full advantage of stretch assignments and all the kinds of things that they could leverage the program for. So we started working with them about what kinds of risks they could take. And they worked and planned that development plan with their diagonal coach as well as their manager to ensure that they really had a robust plan. We then went about really looking at all of the developmental plans. We collected them all. We looked at and analyzed them, working with Steve and his team to say, wow, where are we in terms of the agility scale and what are the capabilities we need to build? We looked at the functional technical and said, what are the things that are core and common that we could leverage micro-learnings for? And what are the things that are very individually based? For the micro-learnings, you can see here a sampling of the kinds of things that we did offer the cohort that were uniquely supportive of their needs. Things like the agility framework, anticipate, which really correlates with foresight, critical and optional thinking, and you can see the rest there on the screen. And then for individual capabilities, this is really where the diagonal coach was a huge benefit, because we ensured that they worked with them for what we called boosters, or opportunities to really accelerate the learning that were really personalized. It might have been a stretch assignment. It might have been a job swap. It might have been working with someone else, and really challenging them to step out of the roles that they do on a day-to-day basis and the comfort zone of programs that they had previously attended. So I've shared with you each of the components. Now I'll lay it out a little bit more in terms of the roadmap of how they experienced it. So in our kickoff session, it was well attended by our senior leadership team, kicked off by the division president. This is where we introduced the agility framework. It was one of the assessments, as I mentioned. They got the results to both assessments, their competency-based assessment and their leader assessment, and they really worked hard on what the development plan was going to be and how they really were going to work through and guide their development. After that residential, there was a period of time where they developed their plan working with their manager and their diagonal coach. At that period of time is where, as I described, we analyzed, assessed the results, and decided what micro learnings and boosters would be beneficial. And then we went into what we called a path forward session. Our path forward session was the next residential, where we brought them back together. And we asked the cohort members, as we brought them into there, what were some of the things that would be most beneficial to them? And the way we designed that, we brought in also the diagonal coaches and their managers so that they had an opportunity to spend time with them face-to-face. Some of them had not yet gotten a chance to meet them face-to-face because of the distance, in terms of where they lived versus the diagonal coach or worked. Many of them had. And We had diagonal coaching briefing sessions and manager briefing sessions to check in on how things were going and things that they were noticing in the cohort and getting them ready for the second half of the program and the journey. With our cohort, what we did is we spent time with them both in opportunities to have exposure with senior leaders. Our senior leaders were actually faculty for a number of the discussions, as were our partners, Steve and some of his colleagues. One of the things that I think was most treasured by the cohort was a day of networking, where we really had paired them based on their preferences up front. We gave them the opportunity to select up to 3 senior leaders. And then in almost speed dating style, they had about 45 minutes, and we rounded them through their appointments. And when they weren't in an appointment, they were in a workshop, they had the opportunity to have some deeper conversations around how they could build their capabilities, how they could develop. And frankly, and I'll share the results in just a minute of our experiment and what we learned when we did an impact study at the tail end of the Succession Accelerations program. What we heard was that the relationships that they made in that networking were so critical to them that a lot more boosters came out of that, a lot more opportunities than they could have ever imagined just simply through the conversations that they had with the leaders and the opportunity that they afforded them. And then as we cleared the path forward, we did program reflection a few months later to say, where are we in the program? We've got about 3 to 4 months left in the program. How do we want to direct our efforts and the efforts of the cohort? Unfortunately, at this time, we were, as a business, affected by a cyber incident. So this actually tested both our agility as a program. It also tested the agility of many of the leaders that were in the cohort. And actually through this very challenging time where we were needing to bring our sites through recovery, many of these leaders had the opportunity to take on extremely stretched roles and really put the principles that we had worked through in the cohort to practice. One of our leaders was tasked with managing to get supplies into Puerto Rico, where one of our sites had been significantly impacted by the hurricane. Another of our leaders was tasked with an increased demand in Ebola and ramping up a facility to take on the production of the Ebola vaccine way ahead of schedule and ahead of time to be able to ensure that doses were available for those that were affected. And so and then others were impacted by trying to bring their sites back online from the cyber incident. So we really had the opportunity to test a lot of principles, and when we came back together at Capstone, had an opportunity to share what they had learned real time from the things that they had applied during this rather intense few months. What it did mean was that we did take a bit of a hiatus, if you will, so the program took a little bit longer than we had originally anticipated. When we came back, we worked on things like relationship collaboration, the views that they had, and we spent a lot of time giving them exposure to next generation in our organization, diversity of thought, so that we could really round out the experience they had with a broad view of the talent and leadership for the future. So that in a really quick encapsulation was the program. Let me stop there, and before I give you the results of our program, let me just ask you, I'm curious, how many of you have a succession acceleration plan, an advanced succession acceleration program like the one I've described or another one that is really aimed at getting your leaders to not just develop, but to really move in terms of preparing their way for a leader pipeline? 0 if it's not developed at all, and 5 if you have an extremely developed program. Okay, and 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Wow, so like many of you, we're only about 18 months into this, right? So 18 months ago, we also didn't have a developed program, and I see the majority of the folks are on the side where we don't have a developed program. I'm hoping you'll get some ideas from this discussion. and start experimenting as we did. We found through our experimenting, and my team is probably on the line that worked alongside every step of the way and was responsible for the success of the program. We found that we tried things and we were able to be agile and decide, that's not really going to work, let's try something different. So I highly encourage you to begin to experiment. Let me share with you some of the results that we found, and I hope that these are also encouraging to you as you begin to think about how you can accelerate talent in the organization. We did a BRINKERHOFF Institute study, and for those of you who may not be familiar with BRINKERHOFF, they are a third party that can come in, and with us they did an impact study. They did interviews with our colleagues, and I will tell you they were ecstatic at the fact that they had a 100% participation rate on the survey. So all cohort members participated in the survey, which they said was unheard of in their years of doing this kind of work, which was really exciting for us because that meant they really had something to say. They felt the program was impactful and they wanted us to hear their thoughts. And then we also, BRINKERHOFF also followed up with 75% of the cohort and had one-on-one interviews with them. So, I'm sorry, 71%. And so here's what we learned. First of all, these keys to success, the thing I will tell you, the overwhelming finding was that the program was successful in getting people to be more ready to fill talent needs at Merck and at a faster rate. One of the direct quotes from one of our cohort participants was that the framework is absolutely right to get future leaders together and to get the culture started. So let's talk a little bit about what each of these numbers mean. We had 47% of our cohort that within the time frame, remember we had targeted folks that were 2 to 5 years out from being promoted into one of these roles. 47% were promoted already into a higher or an expanded role within the time frame of the program. 32%, we saw a 32% improvement on the agility factor. So when we started out with our cohort from the leadership agility, we actually saw a significant raise in their agility scores when we reapplied the assessment or had them reassessed them at the end of the cohort. 92% of our cohort said that they greatly improved their time to readiness. And so of that 47%, they said not only were they promoted, but they were more ready to take on their role. So we really found that just about every member really had an experience where they saw readiness. And then 79% really said that a key ingredient and a key to success was the diagonal coach. And the diagonal coach was somebody who also helped to push them to become more agile, to become more flexible, to stretch beyond themselves, and to give them coaching as they were taking these risks. They found that 79% of the diagonal coaches were either fully or mostly engaged. So that's one of the places where we intend to continue to grow our opportunity to do even more briefing and more coaching with our diagonal coaches, so that we really did feel like that was a key lever to the program. So we did also find that across the cohort, there was more leadership initiative and influence in key strategic decisions. So they found that they were being sought out more. They were also being able to come to the table for critical business issues and drive decisions in a more effective way. And then more of them, in fact, just about all of them, were chosen to be change champions in some of the organization's most strategic initiatives. So the organization, the leaders really saw their ability to be able to take on and drive the future. What we also found was, as I said, networking came out to be one of the strong highlights, so connections with others in the cohort was valuable, the ability to drive connections with leaders in the group, and really be able to leverage those for some of the opportunities that they took advantage of. The other thing I will tell you that came out as a high score or a result, which was an unintended consequence, but certainly an interesting finding for us, was that strictly by being by participating as in a cohort that was as well supported by the leaders, and where they were told, look, I think you've got potential to be at a much more senior level in the organization. Many of them pushed themselves harder than they ever had and recognized in themselves potential they hadn't seen before. It was probably one of the most meaningful moments when one of our cohort members said, I was really happy at the level I was. I wouldn't have even thought of going for a role at a higher level. I figured I was where I should be in the organization. And today she's sitting a level higher than she was when she was in the program. And she would not have thought to even pursue that had it not been for the, I guess you would call it the psychological impact of being said that others saw great potential in her. So we've been excited by the findings. We are gearing up now to leverage this program across our leadership pipeline. We believe we've got a framework that will not only accelerate folks at more senior levels in our organization, but we believe that we can leverage this across other areas in the organization where we are seeing that we can strengthen the pipeline. So I hope that case and that story was inspiring to you, but also really helped you to see how you could apply the leadership agility research that Steve shared with us earlier. And now we're going to turn it over to you, Steve, to share some tips.
Thanks, Teresa. And just a couple of other comments. I mean, I had the good fortune, and others on our team did, to really observe this over time, and you know, and at each moment, whether it was the kickoff, you know, the path forward, or the capstone, I had a chance to be there, and what I got to see was how enthusiastic, how proud, how thankful these leaders were to be getting this kind of an opportunity, and how much they took advantage of it. And again, Merck at this time went through some tough challenges, and these leaders were part of being resilient in overcoming those. And the other thing that, again, we all know, but it was wonderful to see, you know, again, the division president was present, and this was a global organization, and I think you'll hear more about that in some of the Q&A, but people from around the world, very diverse group. But when they came together, he was there, and then they did town halls or virtual conversations on a regular basis where they all got together and talked about what was going on and how can we anticipate better, how can we be more agile in a way that helps the business, what does the business need from us, etc. So a couple of tips, because in the end, that's good, but what did you do to build agility? And we heard all of the vehicles that we used, but a couple of things. So foresight, some people might think, well, you know, you're either born with it or you're not. Well, we don't agree. We think you can actually build foresight. One of the exercises we did, you know, was ask people to identify what were some of the recent surprises that you got caught by, and how might you have, you know, been more prepared? What could you have done? What were the lessons learned? How could you incorporate those? And then we had them go forward and say, well, look, what are potential market shocks? I mean, nobody expected the cyber incident, but by beginning to think more about what could happen, and how would we win, or how would we respond in those situations, we actually did exercises that got people thinking forward. And you all know, everybody's so overwhelmed and consumed by day-to-day just executing and fighting fires. You need to make time to get people thinking outside in, future back, and we did these exercises that got those muscles working. Adaptability, I mentioned, you know, there's a book called the $1 Million Dollar Mistakes, and these authors studied companies that either went out of business or had major catastrophes. And the one thing that they discovered was the organizations were stuck, they weren't adapting, and that there was the absence of challenge. There was the absence of a devil's advocate mindset to debate and challenge current assumptions, which was true in all the companies I showed you earlier. And this is something that we worked on at Merck, because this doesn't come naturally. But we literally shared the notion that build in structure in ways for people to be devil's advocate. And one of the fun things that happened at the Capstone event, I don't know if you were in the room, Teresa, but I was finding out, one of the participants said, hey, I know you feel like we're challenging you a lot, but that's what you taught us to do. So we're giving you a little bit of your own medicine. So it was fun to see how differently, even at the front of the room, we were being challenged at the end of the program than at the beginning. And it was both fun, but it was rewarding to see how this capability set was really taken to heart. Learning, and the one thing I'll say is, and Teresa mentioned it, experiment, learn from those things. And then, real important, when you start down a path, look for disconfirming evidence, which is why it's so important to collect data continuously, whether it's the BRINKERHOFF or whether it's the pre-post on the agility or whether it's just getting feedback. Look for disconcerting evidence that you're not, that something is off. And then you can, and be open to learning and redirecting. And we've talked about resilience. And again, what we see in organizations is that you have to be able to bounce back and be persistent. Those who can get through the tough things quicker, get through that cycle of loss faster and find a way to move on, have a huge advantage. So we've sort of enjoyed laying out some of our ideas and trying in both Teresa's explanation of what they actually did, and then some of these tips, which are still high level, but they give you an idea of things that you can actually work on and build and teach in a learning journey to try to make this notion of building agility practical and real. However, we really would welcome a chance to hear from you, and we know some of you have got some questions that you've been putting out. So we will see some of the questions come on the screen in a moment.
All right, so the first question's for me, Steve. Teresa, can you say more about diagonal coaches and how they were chosen? So our diagonal coaches actually, all of them, I think, raised their hands. So the senior leaders wanted to be extremely invested and supportive. But what we did was we did look, again, at individuals that were 1 to 2 levels above our cohort participants and hopefully in a role that they were aspiring to, or we're going to be able to provide them with a very different experience. In cases where we definitely had more participants than we had members of the senior leadership team, even though they took 2 or 3, then we started going after and looking at leaders in the organization that had those types of experiences, and then we tried to do a match. We talked with the senior leaders whose talent in their organization was we were trying to pair a coach with, and we asked them, would this pairing work? What do you think about? So we really worked between the HR partner, the senior leader who was sponsoring the talent into the program, and the leaders that we have in the organization to try to find the right matches.
And just to comment, because this is easier said than done, and to be fair, I remember when we did our first review, with the leadership team, the MLT, we weren't getting the level of engagement from all the diagonal coaches that we were hoping for. And we put it out there, and it was part of the, a presentation that we laid out. And we also followed up, and we then provided coaching support or a little workshop on how do you apply these principles. So we worked at it. It's not, people are really busy, and even though they care and they're committed, they're busy and they're overloaded. So it took some effort once we had the right people to get them to do the right thing.
All right, let's go and see what the next question is. How did you ensure that you picked emerging talent outside of the traditional behavioral phenotypes to ensure diversity of thought and background? And how did you ensure you were leveraging multicultural backgrounds? Well, I would say the first thing was we did base our selection off of our talent planning and succession planning processes. And our HR partners have done a really good job and continue to work on ensuring that as those talent and succession discussions are happening, we're getting a really strong and diverse view and diverse set of individuals that are being considered to be continuing to grow in the organization. It was also through working with so I worked with each business partner for each line of business and the senior leader to really look at who has had opportunities, who would bring a different level of diversity of thought and diversity multiculturally or to the program. I will tell you, we did I would say an okay job of getting a fully diverse group. We had, I would say, far too many U.S.-based cohort members. As we were piloting, it was a little bit easier, especially since our kickoff was a little tight on time. We would like to increase the global presence. I think we would also like to continue to increase the mix in the group, but I will say that we were very sure that we had diversity from across the business in terms of diversity of practice and areas that we could impact in the business. And we did really have, I think, a great blend in terms of diversity of thought and for the most part, I would say cultural background and gender diversity.
I mean, that was my experience whenever I walked in. It was, first of all, people from all over the world. Yes, more from the U.S., but still, you had the head of you had a very important leader from China, a very important leader from other important markets, and I felt in the room the dialogue was really rich. And as I often find, I'll share my own bias, that women and some of the people who come from diverse backgrounds as well actually make some of the best contributions and add to the richest conversation. And there was a really nice balance of people from different parts of the world and different points of view in different parts of the business. So you could always do better, and I'm sure that is going to continue to be a goal because we all know how important that is. But it's a great question and a great challenge.
And one that we continue to challenge ourselves with as we're looking at this next cohort. We've even upped our ante a little bit in terms of how we're making sure that we are really focusing there. Thanks for the question. All right, and let's see if we have another question. Ready? And there we go. Another one here for me. Teresa, could you please further define micro-learning, the micro-learnings that were in the framework? For sure. So we really were looking at how do we ensure that we provide the right topic at the right level, and we really tried to use a blended approach. So we did some of these through what I would say offline, articles, chapters in books, those kinds of things, particularly as we did the agility framework and some webinars. So with the agility framework, it was largely taken off the research and was based on the research that Steve shared with you today. And we worked through the different, each of the different factors. In fact, agility was one of them. Anticipate was the first one that we did. We also did interpret, and I think which really aligns to the learning piece. And what is it telling you and what do you do with it? And so those were pieces that we pulled right from the framework. What I didn't speak a whole lot to was internal and external partnerships. So how do we work more effectively with suppliers, with individuals that may be our external manufacturing partners, suppliers, and how do we even work better across the organization? Because our operations, and I wonder if those of you on the phone maybe have some still of the same challenges, our divisions could work a little bit more closely together. Manufacturing could work and is beginning to work more with our research labs and our commercial organization. I think there's always opportunity for greater collaboration across. And what was exciting was, as we started the program, one of our cohort members actually took a role in the commercial part of the business. And in our final program, when we were talking a little bit about partnering and end-to-end outcomes, we really were able to look across the manufacturing value stream all the way into commercial and started talking a little bit about different perspectives and how different divisions would like to interact with our manufacturing leaders more. So those were some examples of some of the things. Certainly happy to share more at some point, and happy to entertain any questions as we close this webinar. If you want to reach out and talk to me, happy to answer further.
And we have a lot of questions, but we'll take at least one more and maybe squeeze in two. So. So our board's, making more of a demand for real succession. That's for sure. I mean, I'm lucky or fortunate I get to work with a lot of boards and see the challenge they face, and do we actually have the leaders who we need for the future? And I think so. The progressive boards are investing in this and are seeing that leaders again need more agility, need more collaboration. The reason some boards don't is that I think there's certain companies that just don't want to be as transparent, as Teresa described, or some organizations, the CEO, isn't willing to open up the succession question. So there's a lot of barriers that get in the way. Sometimes people just would prefer not to promote or encourage people to think about bigger roles because they're threatened and protecting. But clearly, progressive boards are all in terms of we've got to develop the leaders of the future, because the leaders who we have now don't have the skill sets, don't have the agility. Now, we believe, this was one of the other questions, and this whole discussion is our belief that you don't have to go necessarily out and find different leaders. We believe you can develop agility, and that's what we spent, the last 2 years doing, with Teresa. In this case, we have an opportunity to do this with lots of other organizations around the world. As again, we find that when we hear what is the gap in our leaders today, the number one gap that comes up over and over again is they need to be more agile. They need to be able to pivot faster. They need to let go of the old, challenge the status quo, and sort of move into a new digital, dynamic, global, diverse world. And we really believe, at Heidrick, that we've developed a set of tools, including assessments. Where are you on agility? Including ways to build it individually, collectively. And so we were delighted to have a chance to share this with you. Now, a couple things on the closeout here. And again, thank you all for joining us. We're passionate. Hopefully that comes through, and we're really proud about the work we've done. But we know there's so much more to be done. You're going to get an email with an on-demand version of this webinar that you can share with others in your circle and your network. And of course, reach out to us. Reach out to Teresa with questions specifically, about what she led and her team did at Merck. Reach out to me for broader questions about these kinds of programs. And we'd be delighted to continue the dialogue both virtually and live if that opportunity presents itself. So once again, thank you from my perspective.
And thank you very much. We really appreciated the opportunity to share with all of you, and thanks for your great questions, and look forward to hearing some of your success stories in the future.
Thank you.